right, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today, we're diving into a topic that a lot of people deal with: shyness and social anxiety. It's something many of us face, but we don't always talk about.
Yeah, it's a big one. Shyness can feel like such a normal part of life, but when it turns into social anxiety, it can really hold you back. We're going to break down the differences, share some personal experiences, and talk about ways to overcome it.
Exactly. I think people often confuse the two, right? Shyness is more like feeling uncomfortable in certain situations, but social anxiety, that's like a deeper fear of being judged or rejected. It can be pretty crippling at times.
Definitely. And it can make things like going to social events, speaking up in meetings, or even just interacting with people day to day feel like huge challenges. But the good news is there are strategies to deal with it, and that's what we're going to focus on today.
Yeah, because even though it feels overwhelming, it's not something you're stuck with forever. You can work on it step by step.
Exactly. One of the first steps is just understanding where those feelings come from. I think a lot of people don't realize how much of it is in our own heads, like we imagine everyone is watching and judging us, when really most people are focused on themselves.
That's so true. I've definitely fallen into that trap, thinking everyone's analyzing my every move, but in reality, they probably don't even notice half the stuff I'm worried about.
Exactly. We overestimate how much people are paying attention to us. It's called the spotlight effect, like we think we're under a spotlight and everyone's watching, but they're not. Once you realize that, it's easier to relax a bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny because I've read about that before, but in the moment, it still feels so real. It's hard to remind yourself that people aren't actually scrutinizing everything you do.
Totally. I think that's where practice comes in, putting yourself in situations that make you uncomfortable, but in a gradual way. You don't have to dive into the deep end and, give a speech in front of hundreds of people right away. It can start small.
Right? Like maybe just talking to someone new or making small talk at a party.
Exactly. The idea is to slowly build up your tolerance to those situations. It's called exposure therapy. You put yourself in mildly uncomfortable situations, and over time, your brain learns that it's not as bad as it seems.
I've heard about that. It's kind of like training your brain, right? The more you expose yourself to social situations, the more you get used to them, and eventually, the anxiety starts to fade.
Yeah, and it's super important to celebrate the small wins, too. Even if it's just saying hi to someone or asking a question in a meeting, those are steps forward.
I think that's where I struggle. I always feel like I need to be perfect or completely confident in every social interaction, but that's just unrealistic. Like nobody has it all together all the time.
Exactly. It's important to be kind to yourself. We're all going to have awkward moments, and that's okay. It's part of being human. One thing that's really helped me is changing how I talk to myself. Instead of focusing on what went wrong, I try to remind myself of what went well.
Yeah, that's a great point. The negative self-talk can really feed the anxiety. If you're constantly telling yourself you're awkward or that you messed up, it becomes a cycle.
Exactly. But if you start shifting that inner dialogue, like instead of saying, I was so awkward, you could say, hey, at least I tried and put myself out there. It changes your perspective over time.
It's funny how powerful our own thoughts are, right? Just changing the way we frame things can have a huge impact on how we feel.
Definitely. Another thing that's really helpful is setting realistic goals. A lot of people who struggle with social anxiety set these impossible standards for themselves, and then they feel defeated when they can't meet them.
Yeah, like expecting to be the life of the party when just showing up is already a big step.
Exactly. It's about giving yourself credit for the progress you're making, even if it's just small steps. And the more you practice, the easier it gets.
That makes sense. I think another big part of overcoming social anxiety is learning how to be okay with rejection or embarrassment. Like sometimes things are going to go wrong, and that's just life. It doesn't mean you failed.
Yes, that's such an important point. Nobody gets through life without awkward moments or rejection. It's normal, but if you can learn to handle it and not let it define you, it loses its power.
Exactly. The fear of being embarrassed or judged is what holds a lot of people back. But once you realize that those moments don't actually define you, it's easier to take risks socially.
Yeah, and the more you put yourself out there, the more you realize that those worst-case scenarios you imagine rarely happen. Most of the time, people aren't judging you nearly as harshly as you think.
It's true. I've had moments where I felt like I completely embarrassed myself, but when I talked to people afterward, they didn't even notice or care.
Exactly. We're our own worst critics. But once you start shifting that mindset, it becomes easier to face social situations with more confidence.
So, to recap, we're talking about exposure, positive self-talk, setting realistic goals, and being okay with mistakes. Those seem like some solid steps toward overcoming shyness and social anxiety.
Definitely. It's all about progress, not perfection. And it's a journey. Nobody expects you to fix it overnight. Just keep working on it and you'll see improvement.
Yeah, that's really reassuring. Thanks for breaking it down like that, Alice. I feel like this conversation is going to help a lot of people who might be struggling with the same thing.
I hope so. Overcoming social anxiety is tough, but it's definitely possible. Just take it one step at a time.
All right, that's it for today's episode, everyone. If you're dealing with shyness or social anxiety, remember, you're not alone, and there's a way forward. Thanks for tuning in.